This episode is brought to you by Temptations Cat Treats. Your cat will come running for the perfectly irresistible Temptations Creamy Puree and Temptations Lickable Spoon Cat Treats. The best time to feed lickable cat treats to your cat is anytime. Feed by hand for a playful moment, in a bowl for a creamy treat, or as a topper to make mealtime fun. Visit TemptationsTreats.com to learn more.
Your gut affects everything, even your mood. So Ollie created 2 brand new products to take care of your insides. Ollie Big 10 Probiotic has 10 strains of probiotics, their most ever, to support a healthy gut microbiome, immune system, and stress response. And Ollie Super Good Superfoods delivers 15 superfoods in tasty gummy form. Find them at ollie.com and exclusively at Walmart.
Ollie!
These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Joan C. Williams, Distinguished Professor of Law and Hastings Foundation Chair Emerita at University of California, College of Law, San Francisco. She's the author of the recently released book, Outclassed: How the Left Lost the Working Class and How to Win Them Back, which we'll be talking about today. Joan Williams, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Meg. I'm really happy to be here.
So I thought we could start with class blindness, which to me emerged as sort of the key concept in the book. So maybe you could get us going by talking about what you mean by that, and also how you came to realize you were class blind and why this matters politically.
Unfortunately, it matters a lot politically. I came to realize I was class blind because I married a guy now almost 50 years ago whose father was a factory worker in Waterbury, Connecticut. And I tell the story in the book of when I first realized how different my family was to his family. When his family came and visited us, Jim and I were both going to Harvard Law School. And first of all, they shocked me by staying in our apartment. I was like, who even does that? And then we were washing dishes together, like, who even does that? And his mother asked me where I kept the butter. And I was like, who does this lady think? I'm a Martian? I just whipped out, I said, under the bed. And she put it under the bed. And I realized she thought I was as weird as I thought she was weird. So I've been studying class ever since. I mean, I'm a classic sort of race, class, gender person. But the ethnographies of the people in the middle, we often call them blue-collar families, although, of course, they're blue and pink and routine white-collar families, like the tire salesman. In that group, they're very focused on self-discipline and order, because that's what you need to survive in a job as an order taker. Whereas I had been brought up very focused on self-development, because that's what you need to survive and thrive in the kinds of jobs that I was being trained for. I've been a law professor since I was in my 20s, really a job as an order giver. And that gap between development and discipline has really deeply shaped American politics. And I'll just give one example to start out. We all know that one of the things that the Trump administration has tried to do is to impose work requirements on everything from Medicaid to food stamps. One of the things that liberals often don't know is that work requirements are supported by majorities of every racial group, and they are also supported more by non-college grads than college grads of every racial group. And that's because of this focus on self-discipline and order and hard work. If you get up every day and go to a job that isn't necessarily thrilling, you are not necessarily super interested in helping out people who don't have to do the same. And that is what I call hard work worship. In elites, we really pride ourselves on merit. In the middle class, often called the scaffold voters, the middle 50%, they pride themselves on their hard work. It's a way of turning servitude into honor. And that's a good example of how there's a gap between just the reality that elites live and the reality that people in the fragile and failing middle class live.
What I think is interesting about that is we have heard a lot of late about the so-called diploma divide. And it sounds to me like what you're saying here is that really it's not so much about education per se, but socialization, I guess, if you will. And maybe those two things go together a bit. But what's really driving this, it sounds like in this story, is that idea of there's this group that, as you put out, sort of the order takers and then the order givers. And I think that's really valuable because I don't really think we look at it that way. Even those of us who get the idea that there really is diploma divide here.
Yeah, the diploma divide, which of course is college, non-college, really reflects the fact that political scientists, in order to measure class differences, use college graduation as the most handy proxy. It's only a proxy. The idea of how you measure class is, I could go on for the rest of the hour and bore everyone to tears. It's a complicated topic. No one cares. But the three classes I think that people should understand in trying to understand American politics are the low-income households in the bottom 30%, then the middle 50%. I will call them the middle or blue-collar voters or scaffold voters. And they have incomes roughly from $42,000 to $95,000. So these aren't poor people, but they aren't rich people either. And then the college-educated elite, the top 20% of household incomes with at least one college grad. And the class conflict that's really driving politics, both in Europe and the United States, is the conflict between the middle and that top college-educated elite.
And, one of the things that you suggested people do in the book is take something called the new class bubble quiz. And I was curious to see what would happen. And when I took this quiz, I scored 100% culturally elite. And so what does that mean? I mean, I'm guessing that when you took it, right, you were right up there too, as I recall, right?
Indeed. Indeed. I was 100% culturally elite. And this measures things that they doesn't measure political stuff. It measures things like what kind of beer would you bring to a party? And if you have a childcare emergency, how would you handle it? So these are one of the things that is really rarely understood is that class is definitely expressed economically, but it's also expressed through cultural differences. And I will give another example that is really important in driving American politics before I urge every single one of your listeners to Google, go to classbubblequiz.org and take the class bubble quiz. We already have 16,000 responses, but we're shooting for a lot more. So another way in which class is expressed through cultural differences that going back to that middle 50%, they not only value self-discipline, they value the traditional institutions that anchor self-discipline. And they do so because self-discipline is so important. I mean, without that, these families would fall. There's a short path to poverty without rigid self-discipline. So they really highly value religion, the military, and traditional family and gender roles. And they also value those traditional institutions for a second reason, because all of those institutions provide paths to social honor that aren't dependent on whether or not you have a classy job. Religion does, the military does. J.D. Vance, in his autobiography, talks about how after he joined the military, he went back to his hometown and the barber gave him a free haircut and said to him, I'm, proud of you. Thank you for your service. Clearly, he was garnering social honor, despite the fact he hadn't yet gone to college and he didn't have a, quote, classy job. But the other thing that is driving politics is that traditional family and gender roles also are another way that people without high status jobs can feel that they're achieving social ideals. In this case, not class ideals, but gender ideals. I'm a real man. I'm a good woman. And elites are really, really different. Our sort of move in the scrum for social honor is to be articulate, sophisticated, and because you think about it, sophistication is one of the ways that we signal our high human capital and our membership to others in this privileged elite group. And because of this mismatch, often elites look down on traditional institutions as unsophisticated or not quite. And that is another instance of class blindness that plays out in politics when Obama, ordinarily I have to say, who really understood how to connect with the white working class, Obama did, but he referred to as my biggest blooper when he talked about bitter people clinging to guns and religion.
I think this is a good point to bring in something called that you refer to as the representation gap. And in the book, you argue that, well, all of this has created this representation gap, and then far-right populism has sort of stepped in to fill this gap. Can you sort of explain what that is and how that occurred in your view?
Well, political scientists have documented the representation gap, and these are transnational studies, and they show that over past decades, there is one group that really hasn't been represented in the candidates of major parties. And that is the group that is socially conservative, but economically liberal. These are the scaffolds. Social conservatives, fiscally liberal. That's where scaffold comes from. And neither the right nor the left represented this group for decades. That's the gap. That's the representation gap. What happened is that the far right came and represented them. So the far right in general is socially conservative, but economically progressive. And what the far right did was something that is really kind of amazing. If you think about it, a lot of the anger that's driving far right populism stems from neoliberal economics. And neoliberal economics really increased the inequality between people. So, for example, virtually every American used to do better than their parents, but now only half do. So people are seeing, especially in this missing middle, this middle 50%, they have seen the waning of the American dream economically. Wages would be 43% higher today if they had kept pace with productivity, as they did in the decades after World War II. And as a result, you have the middle class that is really fragile and often failing. And transnational studies show that this is true across advanced industrialized democracies. There's something called the elephant curve, which a simple way to explain it is that globalization really, really helped lift a lot of Asians out of poverty. But at the same time, the deciles of population that really did not flourish under globalization are the middle class in advanced industrialized countries, exactly the group that is flocked to the far right. And what the far right did is it took the economic anger of this fragile and failing middle class and created that, deflected it away from economic elites, away from the 1%, onto cultural elites, onto the top 20%. And that is basically the formula of far-right populism. The way they did that is, first of all, the far right talks a lot about, uses anti-elitist rhetoric a lot, far more than the left does, which is pretty ironic. But the far right narrative is really that cultural elites are looking down on you, bitter about guns and religion, deplorables. And the move from the left should be left populism. They're robbing you blind because, it's not us who are on the, it's not we feminists who robbed the middle class of their middle class future. It is the economic elites who have pocketed virtually all of the gains of productivity in recent decades.
And so by that, it seems like you don't really buy a view that's very popular in the center left, sort of my folks, generally speaking, the argument that Democrats, if we just move to the center a little more on things like abortion and guns, that just a general move toward more policy centrism on those sort of issues, maybe immigration, trans rights, that would make all the difference in the world. And if Kamala Harris or whoever had just done that, well, we wouldn't be looking at a second Trump presidency. And so really, the solution is simple, just move to the center. You don't buy that.
Well, that's not what the research shows. A lot of it is true that college grads of every racial group are more likely to be liberal than non-college grads. That is true, and it's really important. But and Black people actually are most likely to identify as moderates. And all of that shows that it doesn't make a lot of sense for San Francisco progressives like me to insist the Democratic Party adhere to every single view that I have as a San Francisco progressive. That seems to me like kind of an exercise of racial and class privilege. On the other hand, is the solution just to move to the center? The research doesn't support that either. Most moderates are not centrists. Centrists are the moderates are coded as moderates because they're not consistently liberal or consistently conservative. But many moderates hold some very liberal positions. And we go back, they hold very liberal economic positions. A very specific group called the anti-elites, they were 19% of Trump voters in 2016. We need an updated study, by the way. But these anti-elites, first of all, their racial feelings didn't differ from those of non-Trump voters. And secondly, they were economically very progressive. They were not centrists. And thirdly, on some cultural issues, they held positions similar to the college-educated elite vote. Like 3/4 of them thought climate change was a problem. They actually had the highest levels of support for gay marriage. And so the answer is not that progressives just have to live our values. In other words, control every priority and position. That is not, the research doesn't support that as being viable. Also, by the way, we keep losing elections. So if you like that, please continue, don't change. But the research doesn't support moving to the center either. It's a little more complicated than that. We, number one, have to center progressive economics in a way that I'll describe very specifically in a minute. And number two, we have to forge respectful coalitions on cultural issues where every group gets what they really, really want most. And if you want to know how to do that, I would really recommend the Ezra Klein podcast interviewing Representative Sarah McBride. It's just incredibly, incredibly important. Now, how do we go back and create a coalition around economic issues? We go back to that hard work should pay off in a stable middle-class job. That should be true for people in the middle, and it isn't very often now. And also, in the last election in 2024, young people also veered sharply away from Democrats. And that's, I think, in significant part because even young college grads are facing an economy increasingly that where hard work doesn't pay off in a stable middle-class life. Many of them are stuck in gig work in their 20s, in their 30s. They can't afford housing and childcare. And with AI, that's going to get nothing but worse. And all of this means that the core of the Democratic coalition should be this hard work should pay off in a stable middle-class life. And then on cultural issues, the answer is more complicated. We have to approach each other with respect rather than with condescension and class blindness. And we have to do what people do who want to build a coalition. We have to talk sincerely and make trade-offs.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
Meta AI is the personal AI to help you with whatever you need. Plus, it meets you where you are. Not only is Meta AI now an app, but it's also on the apps you already know and love. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. Plus the Ray-Ban Meta glasses. It's easy to access wherever you are. So whether you're talking or texting, Meta AI is convenient to use throughout your day. Experience our newest AI that's tailored to you by downloading the Meta AI app. Try the Meta AI app today on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
I guess I feel in part that a lot of Democrats or some Democrats have tried to do that, but the problem, it seems to me, at least in part, is that a lot of these international economics is a complex thing, right, with all kinds of moving parts. And there are always two parties playing at this game. And so we as Democrats can try to define ourselves in that sort of economic populist way to kind of reach folks. But then I see the other side saying, well, ask them what they think about women and men's, biological women and men's sports. And then we just kind of, it seems like can't just go, and just lock up. And because I feel like a lot of these cultural issues are just inherently easier to grasp, at least in some way, and that sort of gives the populist right maybe an advantage because they can speak in a way that's easier for folks just intuitively grasp than when we're talking about more complex economic issues. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but hey, as a left-wing elite, that's kind of what I do for a living.
Yeah, exactly. Join the club. That's what I do for a living too. I don't think it's complicated to talk about economic issues. I think that the Democrats need to be talking about, as I keep saying, hard work should pay off. That's not complicated. It doesn't. There's research that shows that there is far greater level of support. 70 to 86% of Americans believe that the rich earn too much and that workers earn too little. Mike, that's not complicated. And that's supported at far higher levels than government redistribution programs. One of Democrats' problems is that they talk about economic issues in a way that doesn't connect with where people are at. They often talk about the minimum wage, for example. Now, don't get me wrong, the minimum wage is really important for that bottom 30%, super important. But minimum wage jobs are what middle-class people are trying to avoid. That's not going to reach them. It's an important prospect. It's not helpful in building a coalition in luring back these anti-elites. So I think you can talk about economic issues in very, very simple ways. I also think that cultural issues, especially trans issues, have been pointed to as kind of an easy out for Democrats who are reluctant to use anti-elitist rhetoric, which, by the way, Republicans have been using for decades because of pressure from donors. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. But just think about that ad that everyone is focused on. Kamala cares about they, them. Trump cares about you. Now, that definitely picked up anti-trans voters, transphobic voters, totally got that. However, it also attracted a much larger group of voters who were really angry that Democrats were not talking about their number one issues, which were the inflation and the economy. And so I think to say, we just have to throw all these cultural issues to the wind is not that accurate. Once we start centering the economy, people will focus on the economy. That's what they wanted to hear. In fact, Democrats focused a lot on defense of democracy. And hey, Mike, do you think democracy needs defending right now?
I
do.
Yeah.
I do. On the other hand, to defend democracy in the long term, we need to do something really different than we need to defend democracy in the short term. In the short term, we need to do just what we're doing. Talk about it all the time, get on the streets, be in Congress, resist the resistance. But to defend democracy in the long term, we need to rebuild our relationship with non-college voters, because non-college voters are 63% of Americans. We cannot protect democracy so long as we are losing overwhelmingly among non-college voters.
On that topic, I want to bring up something that doesn't sound maybe initially connected, but I think is, and something I've been thinking about more and more lately, is aesthetics, because I feel like there are these, what I'll call aesthetic differences that I believe are sort of very alienating in a way. For instance, I see things like Donald Trump is clearly obsessed with gold, and more gold on everything. His redesign of the White House, I look at it, it makes me want to gag. Or the McDonald's everywhere. I just find it just so incredibly tacky and off-putting. And it occurs to me that this is probably not just me. And I'm sure that this also applies to Trump voters and elites on the left who would probably look at Trump voters and say, oh my God, these angry, tacky people, and they can't really connect because they don't have a lot of experience, I guess, with those people. So I guess is part of the answer just simply just spending more time with people who don't necessarily know anything about, classical music or literary fiction or any of the weird podcasts, I guess, or any of the stuff that we on the left seem to love so much?
Yeah, tacky is literally a euphemism for low class, right? So these are class insults. And what you put your finger on, Mike, is really important. Class is expressed through cultural differences, and including differences in tastes and talk culture. For example, among non-elites, they're very proud that they don't have to use fancy talk and network and try to impress everybody in order to do well in their jobs. That's the way they see our networking and what we think is tact and political savvy. They're like, we don't have to do that. They have to suck up to other people. We don't. We just go in and do our job, and we work hard and we do it well. We don't have to suck up to anybody. And so their preference is for talk that is straightforward, direct, and authentic. They think Trump fits the bill. Straightforward, direct, authentic. Now, he lies all the time.
Yeah,
that's true. That's true. But his anger against elites is very authentic. He's angry because in the past decades, he couldn't get on museum boards because of WASPy people in New York City. He's not angry at the same elites they are, but that's all. He manages to elide that difference. He is very direct, authentic, and straightforward, which is their preferred speaking style. Our preferred speaking style, we've been doing it, Mike, is like measured, learned, nuanced, articulate. I call it the Rachel Maddow style. That's very often the way Democratic candidates sound. And when they sound that way to us, the message that is being sent to non-college voters is that they're not an important audience. We as progressive elites have to stop insisting that our candidates sound like that, because that is a short road to losing.
I guess I feel, though, also that it's a little more complicated than to sound different, because when I've heard politicians who try to do that, who clearly aren't really of that class, it comes across as just even worse than if they'd said nothing at all, awkward references to the sports team or something like that. And I feel like you can really tell a difference when you hear like someone who feels more authentically working class, who's on the left, who talks about these things. And so I feel like it's more that we don't just need to re-educate, if you will, our current crop of national politicians on the left, but we need to draw from maybe different areas from people who have more of that working class background. But yet it seems that that's not necessarily the direction that the Democratic Party is terrifically interested in going in.
There used to be a lot more working class candidates than there are now. And there is polling that shows that working class candidates, not surprisingly, do better with working class voters. But the other thing is, let me push back a little bit. I think of Gretchen Whitmer, and I actually don't know whether her parents were college educated, but her campaign slogan at one point was "Fix the damn roads." She wasn't making, clunky cultural references that really weren't hers, but she was just talking in a very direct, unvarnished way, then connecting with how she was going to make voters' day-to-day lives better. And that, in many ways, is the model. And as you point out, this is not an easy thing to do, because it has to be authentic. Authenticity, all voters like authenticity, but these voters in the middle really demand authenticity. That presents particular challenges for women, Mike, because women candidates, and we saw this both in Hillary Clinton and in Kamala Harris, they have to walk a really tightrope between proving themselves 9 million times in order to prove that they are in fact up to the job, because the assumption is they aren't, but also not being braggy and being very warm and likable. And consequently, they often develop this style very different from Gretchen Whitmer of being very cautious about what they say, and everything is very studied. And the reason they do that is they're trying to navigate gender bias, but it comes off as inauthentic.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about was patriotism. Patriotism is huge on the right. And honestly, I consider myself very patriotic, but I feel like for a lot of folks on the left, it's a real sort of fraught relationship. And you say patriotic, or you put a big American flag, like in a football game in front of somebody who's sort of further left, and they to just roll their eyes is sort of
like tacky. It's tacky.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, but patriotism, okay, the flag the size of freaking Rhode Island is maybe tacky, but patriotism in and of itself isn't necessarily tacky. Yet a lot of people on the left are like, I don't know. And I feel like that's a huge gap. What do you think's going on here?
Well, again, it goes back to this central dynamic of the scrum for social honor. Among elites, again, we pride ourselves in being members of a global elite. And what we're doing is we're stressing our class status, our transnational class status. Among non-elites, they can't do that. So they stress one of the categories that they belong to, one of the only categories they belong to that is high status, being Americans. And so if you look at the polling data, non-elites are far more patriotic and they far more proud to be an American and place being American much more at the center of their identities than elites do. But both groups are just doing the same thing. They're stressing what makes them look good. It's a very human thing. And so the idea that being patriotic is tacky, again, that is a typical kind of class insult that is making it very hard for Democratic candidates to win. And kind of the deepest message of the book is that a lot of the things that your crowd, Mike, and my crowd, and I do every day are making it are helping the far right, who owns patriotism right now. We shouldn't let the far right own patriotism. As you point out, there are many things about this country that we cherish. Otherwise, we wouldn't be fighting so hard to defend our democracy and our values. We shouldn't be embarrassed to focus on that. Although we should, to follow up on something we were talking about earlier, we should recognize that talking all day about the defense of democracy, again, it's Democrats' tin ear. It's not going to land with people who feel like the status quo has screwed them for the past 40 years, because it has screwed them for the past 40 years. And if we're perceived as defenders of the status quo, we're not going to defend it.
Yeah, it occurs to me also that there's another way to look at this. And some people on the left would say, what we really have here isn't so much a class or a diploma divide. It might be what you call, and this is going to, I'll put it in the most condescending way possible, but an enlightenment divide. And what I mean by that is that, you go to college, you learn more about the world, and your eyes are opened up. You realize there are these marginalized groups, there are the systemic racism and sexism, and we still see the effects of these things. And so if this is the case, then the answer is really just to enlighten more people and not to somehow speak the language of the less enlightened, but we have a duty to raise them up, if you will. And again, I am presenting this, of course, in the absolutely most infantilizing, but go ahead. I want your response to that.
Yeah. And there are scholars even that do this and say we're getting more and more enlightened in every generation. By the way, young people are veering hard to the right. So I don't think that's true. I think maybe the best, this has to do with, this is a very parochial reaction of like, my truths are true and enlightened, and your truths are untrue and unenlightened. Yeah. We need to see the water we swim in. And one of the ways I try to explain this in the book is by looking what happened during the pandemic. The United States had really bad results during the pandemic. We had shutdowns that were far longer. We had school shutdowns that were outlandishly longer. We had lower levels of vaccination. We had higher death rates. We had terrible results. And I argue, again, along with an epidemiologist, Monica Gandhi, who was arguing this throughout the pandemic, that the public health responses to COVID were not being shaped by public health mandates and public health knowledge. They were, what I argue, that they were being shaped by a very specific parochial, class-specific ideology that I call super safism. Super safism, it's the easiest to explain if you think about the design of playgrounds. In my day, playgrounds had all kinds of things that we now see as wildly dangerous. And playgrounds in the United States have become so super safe that they're actually less safe than playgrounds in Europe that aren't designed to be so obsessively safe, because kids want a thrill. And so if there's no other way to get a thrill than to go swinging by standing on the shoulders of your friend who's on the swing, you'll do it. And this super safism, this anxiety about whether we're safe, is really an effect of neoliberalism on elites. That it used to be that incomes were far more evenly distributed, and so there was less crime and less social disorder. And as elites were bringing up children, and I was part of this in the 90s and the early parts of this century, we were very focused on whether our kids were going to develop every single little talent immediately because we knew that it was a very competitive economy. We knew that it had become very unequal. And so what happened with COVID policy is that if you look at COVID policy and compare it to policy in other countries, COVID became a culture war in the United States between elites' super safism, which led to things like long shutdowns, very long school shutdowns. COVID policy was also class parochial in another way, and that we could afford the long shutdowns because we could do our jobs sitting in front of a computer in our pretty nice houses. And our kids often were not getting as disadvantaged by school shutdowns as less privileged kids were. And so this unselfconscious desire, this economic anxiety, we got to keep everything safe. We got to keep everything safe. You know, that's actually what Monica Gandhi points out is that that's not realistic in a pandemic. In a pandemic, what you do for public health policy is you make intelligent balances between goals, disease suppression goals, and other goals like economic goals. And so you remember how the economy was the number one issue for Trump voters? Democrats got a really, really bad rap, which was unfortunately significantly true, that Republicans were the ones that cared about the economy, and they didn't care about the economy for ordinary working class people. That's an example of class blindness. It warped public policy, and it's warping American politics, and it's empowering the far right, and it's killing people.
And we can juxtapose the COVID experience against something else you talk about in the book, and that's same-sex marriage, where you essentially make the argument that we on the left can learn a lot if we take a look at how views on same-sex marriage have changed. For instance, 20 years ago, Gallup found that 59% of Americans didn't think same-sex marriages should be recognized as valid. Today, only 29% of Americans feel that way. And so obviously the question is, well, how did that happen? And more importantly, what can we what can the progressive left, I'm not progressive left, but I am left, what can we learn from this, and why does this story matter to us?
It's really important. I mean, I've been a social justice warrior for 40 years, and the only huge success I've seen in my life is gay marriage. So I talked to a colleague of mine, Matt Coles, who headed up the Marriage Equality Project for the ACLU. And one of the things he told me is that, which I remembered because I lived through this as well, kind of being a gender person very much at that point, the gay liberation movement was not focused on gay marriage in the 1990s. They were focused on sexual liberation. They were focused on getting legal rights for a very broad range of relationships. They thought marriage was kind of done and dusted. One might even say, Mike, tacky. And I said, well, how did you folks change? And he said, well, I and other advocates got the domestic partnership law passed in California in the late 1990s. And the Alameda County court clerk invited me to the first day people were coming to tie the knot. And he said, I'm not going to do that. My job is done. This is very performative. He said, but I went anyway. And she had set up little tables with heart balloons and organized a grand procession down one of these wonderful grand 19th century staircases. And he said to me, and this is a quote, he said, "The people coming down the stairs, they weren't doctors and lawyers. They were ordinary, average people." And he said, "I get it now. It's the prom and the wedding ceremony and everything rolled into one. They're finally able to say, 'Mom, yeah, I got married.'" So what he was really saying is that we often hear that Democrats need to change messaging, and they did change messaging, by the way. They stopped focusing on equal rights and started focusing on commitment, because they asked middle-class people, "What does marriage mean to you?" And they said commitment. But the only reason they could change messaging is that they changed priorities. They changed priorities in order to connect with the moral intuitions of everyday Americans. And to do that, then doing that meant that, 24% of Americans supported gay marriage at the time that that same domestic partnership bill was passed in California. And then it skyrocketed up to the high was, I think, 74%. But they did the work and they built the coalition.
Now, I can hear some people hearing this and say, oh, sure, you talk about how the people on the right love stability and commitment and all that. But when you actually look at the data, it's the Trumpiest states that are leading the country when it comes to divorce rate, teen pregnancy rates, single parent households. And so they'll say, well, come on, this is maybe a rhetorical commitment to these things. But in reality, the red states are actually worse at that. So what do you make of that?
What I make of that is that poverty and instability make for destabilized families. We don't laugh at poor people because their families fall apart. That would be tacky. But we often laugh at red states because their families fall apart. The reason we're laughing at poor people. And if you have to struggle to keep your family together, if you have to work every waking minute to keep your family together, and as a result, you lose touch with your partner. I mean, a lot of these families in the middle, they tag team, which means that mom works one shift and dad works another shift. Tag team families have 3 to 6 times the national divorce rate. And so you look back with nostalgia at a time when, your family could be supported on one income with a little intermittent work from mom. That looks a lot better. Now, this nostalgia is looking back affectionately at a time when it's for damn sure that kind of family structure was far more available to white families than it was to black families. So is there an element of white privilege? That's true. But what the response on the left should be is not to, okay, let's not listen to these people because they were enjoying white privilege then. It's like, yeah, we want that for everybody now. That's the solution, not to belittle people for their disadvantage, which is what we too often unconsciously do.
I want to ask you about men in particular, because that's a group that the left really has been struggling with a lot. And pretty clearly, the right has really glommed onto the whole manosphere sort of thing. And to many of us on the left, we see some of this and we say toxic masculinity and so forth. And what's the problem do you see for folks on the left, particularly appealing to what I'll call manly men? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that this is a transnational phenomenon. Especially among the young men and young women, there's young men are veering sharply right across the world, including in Europe and even in Korea. Why is this? Well, about 70% of men feel that they receive more social approval when they behave in masculine ways. And so men are really, really attached. Masculinity is a cherished identity for many, many men. And as we've talked about, even more so for men who are not advantaged by class, because they can't be, maybe they're not the owner of a factory, but they're a blue collar guy who's a real man. That's the path to social honor. And we've already heard about how the economy has gutted the middle class, especially blue collar men. And what the research shows that when men's masculinity is threatened, they tend to double down on masculinity. For example, by voting for Mr. Macho, because the right understands how to manipulate this. And the left has been tongue-tied because the kind of politically correct thing in my crowd is to hope for a gender-neutral future. Masculinity is kind of tacky. And I hope for a gender-neutral future. I'm working for a gender-neutral future. But the way to do that is not to cede the power of masculinity to the far right. That is taking us in exactly the wrong direction. So we have to do two things. Number one, we have to contest Trump's ownership of being a real man. And here we have a beautiful model. Have you heard of taco tariffs? The taco stands for Trump always chickens out. And it drives him nutso. And it signals that this guy isn't a real man. Why we aren't using that kind of maneuver to communicate, that's not what a real man does. And he is not even, he's a chicken. Why we're not doing that every day of the week, it shouldn't just be taco tariffs. That's the model. But the other thing is, on the left, we have to realize that masculinity is a cherished identity for most men. And we have to find ways to connect with elements of masculinity. And here I speak as a gender theorist. There are elements of masculinity, Mike, that are pretty great. Confidence, being authoritative, knowing your own mind. All of those are pretty great things for men and for women. Now, we put them into this, package, and there are very important positive values that are associated with masculinity, just as there are very important positive values that are associated with femininity. I mean, we create these two weird dichotomous packages that mix the positive values up with non-positive values. That's the problem. The problem isn't, though, with masculinity alone. The problem is much deeper with those two weird packages. So let's find the elements of masculinity that are genuinely positive and connect with those.
Yeah, I know you talk in the book about the left deploying alternative masculinities. When I thought about how that might work in practice, I was thinking about, and you mentioned the Trump example, things like, well, what's it mean to be a real man? Well, you take care of your family, you're loyal.
Yeah, exactly.
But then
all the soldier values.
Exactly. But then
where are the soldier values?
But then I think, and so that's my first thought. And it's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because in those ways, Trump is essentially doing what I would call performative masculinity. Yes. But then I think, but maybe a good hunk of the public really, or males in the public, and maybe even females as well, to them, masculinity has become so perverted as a concept that maybe to a lot of people, that's what they actually think of as masculinity, as sounding tough and being a bully, and not these things that I would argue are true masculinity, like being loyal and stalwart and all that sort of things. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff going on there, but go ahead.
Well, I would just direct your attention to your assumption, which is that you know what and value the things that are truly valuable in masculinity, and that the public is captive to the toxic elements in masculinity. We've learned not to stereotype people of color in negative ways and make assumptions without knowledge about negative qualities that they might have. We need to have that same self-awareness when it comes to social class. And the data doesn't back up what you just said. It is not that, uneducated people believe in evil masculinity and we believe in pure masculinity. What the data shows is that masculinity is very widely endorsed as an ideal across class, and that there are good elements to it and there are nasty elements to it.
In part,
sorry,
go ahead.
Sorry to call you out.
No, please do. Yeah, no, go, please do. Yeah. Absolutely. I guess I keep on coming back to how this would play out in reality, because authenticity is so important. Be able to speak to people in a language, speak to people, meet them where they're at, speak to them in their own language, and not in a condescending, but in an authentic way. And it seems to me that is something that you can't just take some Ivy League educated, lifelong super striver and say, here, watch this documentary or read this book, and you'll be transformed. It seems to me if we want to be able to do that, we need different candidates. We need people with different lived experiences. And I guess that's where I really struggle, because I'd like to see more people like that, but I don't know how we get from where we're at to there.
Well, number one, it would help if we really were committed to winning. But number two, look at J.B. Pritzker. J.B. Pritzker performs a very cocky and confident variant of masculinity. He's worth, according to my internet, $3.7 billion. He talks in a very direct, unvarnished way. One Trump voter said, Trump doesn't sugarcoat things. Neither does J.B. Pritzker. I completely agree with you. We need more working class candidates. Absolutely. We Democrats used to have them, and now they're scarce as hen's teeth, to use an old-fashioned expression. But people like J.B. Pritzker, Gretchen Whitmer, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, this is how Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, who went to college, by the way, talks about climate change. She said, my husband and I own an auto body shop. And when it's 116 degrees outside, we can't go to work. There she's connected climate change to hard work worship. That is, you can do that with a college degree. You just need to figure out how to do it.
I guess to close things out, I always like to try to close on an optimistic note whenever we can. And to me, honestly, when I look at the modern Democratic Party, I just sort of don't feel much optimism at all. But I'm hoping you can is there something when you look out in the landscape of what we are doing on the left and how we are maybe, I hope, changing in some ways? Can you point out any things that you say, this is grounds for at least some optimism?
I'm always optimistic just because, in my view, being pessimistic is not an intellectual challenge. Being optimistic is the intellectual challenge these days. I think we are being handed a generational opportunity by Mr. Trump. First of all, DOGE is an amazing gift to begin to explain to the American people how government programs underlie a stable middle-class life. There are cuts on the horizon for Social Security offices, Medicare offices, big Medicaid cuts, and there have been cuts to farm subsidies that farmers rely on. So I think we have a generational opportunity to explain to the American public why government is important and explain to them that they actually support more government, not less government. I also think that tariffs, when they begin to take hold, if he doesn't always chicken out, will take away from workers the one thing they got from globalization, which was cheap Nikes, and leave them with their fragile and failing jobs, and will fuel economic anger. If we only can eliminate the class blindness that is making us unable to connect with it. And I think we have a lot of very talented candidates in the Democratic Party my only message is to people like me. I'm a San Francisco progressive. Let's not make it difficult for those candidates to succeed by insisting on a level of control over the Democratic Party that is inconsistent with our ideals as progressives.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah, no, I like that. Definitely that's something I could not agree more. And so I think that is a fantastic note to close on. Joan Williams, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,